I was reading this last week. It's now seen as one of the biggest threats to democracy, to free debate, and even to civilization. Fake news. Of course, as well as it being the favourite term of a certain president, Donald Trump, it was also named as 2017's Word of the Year. I mean, I don't know who chooses these things, but maybe the Oxford Dictionary or other people. But anyway, it was 2017's Word of the Year, fake news. Significant, of course, because fake news is raising misunderstandings and tensions between nations. And so it's very important now. In many countries there's a big, well, it's a global drive really to regulate social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram because of the spread of fake news. In fact, so great is the danger that the doomsday clock, that's something else you might not have heard of, but there's a thing called the doomsday clock, which scientists and social scientists and so on, they, across the world, it symbolizes the threat of global extinction, of wiping out the whole planet, the doomsday clock. And that has moved now to 2 minutes to midnight. Mainly, recently, so I read, because of the rise of fake news. Obviously, it also depends on the threat of nuclear war and other things like that, but because of fake news, that threat has been raised. So, we're 2 minutes to the end of everything, folks. Are you ready? The doomsday clock is ticking down. Chaos reigns, especially in the information systems of the world now, on which, of course, agreements and treaties and civilization depends, trust. We don't know what's true, we don't know what's false anymore. It might be fake news. So we've got to check it out now somehow, before believing what we read. And if we don't, then there could be serious consequences for us all. Fake news. Well, here this morning in our reading from Joshua 9, we have a prime and a primal example of fake news, a very early example of fake news. Here's a warning, I suppose, to us all on just this very obvious level to check things out before we make decisions. That's what Joshua should have done. He should have checked it out, but he failed to do so. And so they lived with the consequences of that decision for the rest of their history, the children of Israel. So, let's just think about it this morning briefly. This morning, first of all, we have what I'm calling a sly story. A sly story. Here's a classic case of fake news. What's the story that they told? Well, let's just think first of all, where are we in the journeys of Joshua? You remember there's been this great victory over Jericho, then the shameful defeat at Ai. Last Sunday we thought about the awful consequences of unrepented sin, secret sin, in the example of Achan. And although we haven't read it because we've left out the chapter now, at the end of chapter 8, there's been a big meeting of all the tribes at Mount Ebal. And there they've all agreed to be faithful to the covenant that's been made between them and God through Moses, between them and Yahweh. And now, immediately after that wonderful ceremony, the end of chapter 8 of covenant renewal, there comes this threat, two threats really, to the progress of the children of Israel, to their very lives really, the children of Israel. One threat is open, and it's clear, it's obvious, but the other one is subtle and sly and quite cunning. So we read about them here as we heard our readings of all those difficult names which we knew how to navigate so well. But anyway, here it is. Now, when all the kings west of the Jordan heard of these things, that is, the things that had been happening to the children of Israel and what Joshua and the troops had been doing, the kings in the hill country, in the western foothills, along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea as far as Lebanon, I won't name them all again, they came together to wage war against Joshua and Israel. So there's the one threat. That's an open threat, that's a military threat, it's obvious, it's real. Instead of trying to fight them one by one, they decided, these kings and tribes, they're all going to come together and take on the Israelites in one big battle. Well, that's an obvious threat. Meanwhile, we read in the very next verse these words. However, when the people of Gideon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse, that is, to a trick. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and wineskins and cracked and mended. They put patched sandals on their feet. They wore old clothes. All their bread, their food supply was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the Israelites, "We have come from a distant country. Make a treaty with us." So now here's the other threat. But this is a very different one, isn't it? This is a sly, this is a cunning plot to trick Joshua and the Israelites. They want a treaty with them so that their lives will be spared. So you see what's happening here in this passage. Here's a warning about the ways in which the enemy attacks us. If we're thinking about the spiritual lessons that we can learn, this is an important warning for us in the spiritual warfare which we have to fight every day. Here we have the sort of two aspects of the enemy's strategy, the devil's strategy. The first is straight, open warfare. He's pictured in the Bible as a roaring lion on times. That's one aspect of the nature of his attacks. A roaring lion who prowls around, waiting to persecute, to kill, to destroy. It's open, it's obvious. And I suppose we can think of forces in the world today like IS, I suppose, in the Middle East. It's the roaring lion, persecution. Hundreds of families, thousands perhaps, have been brutalized, killed by these forces of evil, beheading even children because they will not renounce their faith in Jesus. That's obvious, that's awful, that's open. But you see, the second aspect of the devil in the way in which he appears to us, the scriptures tells us, he often appears as an angel of light. That's not so easy to recognize. It's not so obvious. It's deceptive. As Paul in the Ephesian epistle talks about it, he talks about the wiles of the devil, his tricks. It's subtle, it's deceptive, his cunning ways. And this is his second mode of attack, if you like. It's not so obvious, not so open. And he gets us so many times. And I think in spiritual terms, that's what this chapter is talking about. It's this kind of subtle attack for which we have to be on our guard. So notice how the Gibeonites approach the leaders of Israel. First of all, they use deceptive ways. They take every possible step to deceive Israel. They carry these old sacks on their donkeys. They have broken and bound up wineskins, patched shoes, shabby clothes, even moldy bread. All these deceptive ways, first of all, so that they can trick Israel. And then they also use deceptive words. Apart from the outright lies, of course, which they said that they'd come from a far country, they also impressed and deceived Joshua by reporting all that they'd heard about the Israelites. Though, of course, interestingly, they don't mention the recent conquests of Jericho and Ai, the things that happened only just a few days ago, which a nation coming from afar would not have perhaps heard about. No, they were very clever. They just talked about Egypt and what had happened in the past. Very clever, very sly. And as Christians, we have an enemy who is very sly, very skilled at deceit. So if an outright attack doesn't work upon us, the roaring lion approach, then there's the subtle, the deceptive approach, which he often adopts. Especially like our circumstances, where there's not great persecution, there's not people stopping us coming to worship, but we're living in fairly easy circumstances, affluent, we have all that we need. He comes in these subtle ways to tempt us. Remember like the Gibeonites, Satan, he knows about God. He knows the Word of God. And he's good at taking it and twisting it and wrongly applying it. He did that with Jesus, didn't he? Satan has often taken Scripture out of context. Or he just selects part of the truth, like these Gibeonites did, and he even uses the Word of God to trick God's people at times by a wrong interpretation or an unhelpful application, or straight out into foolish or sinful behavior, sometimes even justifying it on the basis of the Word of God. Very subtle, very sly. Now all that's bad enough, of course, But here in this instance, it's made much worse by an uncharacteristic lapse, I think, to be fair to Joshua, in his leadership. It's not characteristic of Joshua, really. So from a sly story, we now have a lax leader. A lax leader. If you look up the word lax in the dictionary, you'll find these sorts of words to explain it. Careless, casual, neglectful. Now, if you listen to those words, of course, none of those words are the sort of description you would want of a leader, would you? Careless, casual, neglectful, especially a military leader. And of course, again, applying it spiritually in terms of our spiritual life, if that's the sort of attitude we have, then it's a recipe for failure for us. If you and I, if we're careless, if we're casual, if we're neglectful towards our walk with God, then our discipleship is bound to suffer. We're going to be deceived. We become vulnerable to any attack and to the temptation of the evil one. So here in the story this morning, we see Joshua acting in a very casual way. Rather than being very careful and examining the story that these visitors are spinning to him and seeing if it's fake news, he quickly jumps to the wrong conclusion. He believes what they say. It seems the Israelite leaders, they made some sort of assessment. Verse 14 tells us they sampled their provisions, but they were completely taken in by this trick. And they jumped to a decision far too quickly. Because the passage tells us that only 3 days later, if they just waited 3 days later they discovered the truth about the Gibeonites. Verse 16, 3 days after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors living near them. So what went wrong? Well, that very same verse 14, tells us what went wrong. The Israelites sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. But did not inquire of the Lord. You see, they were, in a sense, they were doing some of the things right. They sampled their provisions. They were trying to examine what this story meant, but they didn't bring God into it. They did not inquire of the Lord. So they had no discernment, if you like. They lacked wisdom. There was no prayer. They had no guidance from God in this matter. I suppose that's one of the great things about the Bible, isn't it? You get all these great men of God and women of God, Moses, David, Joshua, and so on, but they have their weaknesses. They have their failures, just like you and I do. Joshua did many wonderful things. He was a great leader in many ways, but now recently we've just seen two blunders, two mistakes which he made. After Jericho, he went off straight away to tackle Ai, and now he's not asking of the Lord. They did not inquire of the Lord. He should have asked of God. He should have inquired regarding what was presented to him, but he doesn't do it. And really, as the leader, he is responsible for that mistake. And so he's deceived, and the Israelites are deceived. There's no discernment in him. So, how do we bring God into things so that we avoid this sort of mistake? Well, there are many ways in which the scriptures tell us, but probably the most famous, and I often think of this, and it's a very helpful verse, Proverbs 3, verses 5 to 7. If we're doing this, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes, but fear the Lord and shun evil. Great advice for walking the Christian way successfully. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, in all your ways, no matter how small, not just in the big things, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. You see, because when it comes to the wiles of the devil and temptations on, we're just not up to the task without God's wisdom and God's strength. That's why we need the Word of God. That's why we need a close daily relationship with God. so that we walk aright. I think sometimes one of the gifts that's probably lacking in the church worldwide today is this gift of wisdom, this gift of discernment, discerning the spirits, discerning teaching. It so easily creeps in and leads people astray. It's one of the most neglected gifts, I think, if you think of all the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Discernment. It's not often talked about or taught about. And it comes through knowing God's will, through His Word, through His prayer, by the Holy Spirit. It's a gift of the Spirit, discernment. And here in this example, we see a lack of discernment from the leaders, but from within the whole nation. Everything happens really quickly. That's sometimes a red flag, isn't it? Take time, especially in big decisions. They don't take time to stop and ask God. And I think sometimes when things are presented to us, perhaps individually or as a church, we're like that. We sometimes can make too hurried decisions without really asking God. And what the devil is trying to do here, of course, is to bring into this holy nation unholiness. A nation that's not supposed to be there, really, according to the plan of Joshua, the book here. He's trying to join Israel, if you like, with the Gibeonites, who they're supposed to drive out. And that surely is a picture of the Christian life, isn't it? For you and for me, and for the church. Our enemy always wants us to be joined in some way. He wants to infiltrate. He wants to bring trouble. And he'll do any way to bring that into our lives. He'll want to cause your walk with God to slip, to make bad decisions, to bring you into trouble, to take you away from the straight path. And that's what's happened here now. The world, if you like, has entered into this nation. And in the same way, the world, the flesh, the devil, can defeat us. We can be defeated because of our lack of prayer, our lack of discernment. And yes, Satan does come as an angel of light. And our foe, our deceptive foe, Satan, he wants to bring about in our lives these small treaties, these small alliances, these small agreements with sin, which seem very innocuous perhaps, subtle, sly. He wants us to compromise, to have these agreements with sin which will spoil our walk with God, and they will not be beneficial to us. They'll render us ineffective. They'll make us stumble and fall. So, lax leadership allows the enemy in, and this treaty with the Gibeonites is made, it's sealed. And they live with it for the rest of their life as a nation. But, happily, that is not the end of the story. If we read on, not just in this book, but again throughout the Old Testament, as history progresses, we find that grace triumphs eventually over Joshua's mistake. So finally, a gracious God. A gracious God. So in the story we come to the sort of denouement, the big reveal. This is the moment when Joshua finally confronts the Gibeonites, having realized he's being deceived, and he asks them a simple question: why did you deceive us? The answer of the Gibeonites is very significant. This is what they said: because it was told to your servants, that's to us, it was told to us for a certainty that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land, and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you, and we've done this thing. So the Gibeonites feared God. They feared the Lord. So did this fear save them? Well, no, of course it didn't. Just fearing God, not in and of itself, that doesn't save us. But no, this fear of the Lord was good. This fear of the Lord and what they'd heard moved them to this action, to this trick. And amazingly, that brought them within the saving purposes of God. The treaty was made, and because it was made in the name of God, Joshua rightly felt he had to keep to it. He couldn't go back now. Otherwise, where is truth? Who can you trust? And so they're brought within the saving purposes of God. In many ways, of course, this reminds us of chapter 2, doesn't it, of Rahab, remember? When we were looking at Rahab. She and the Gibeonites, they're moved to action because they come to a realization of the truth of Yahweh, of God. The God of Joshua, the God of the Israelites, that he truly is worthy of fear. He is the only true God. And he is mighty. And they better join him, or else they're going to be destroyed. And ultimately, through this fear, through this encounter, they're introduced to the God of grace. See, both Rahab and the Gibeonites, they're accepted by Israel, even if it is under strange and dubious circumstances. Rahab and the Gibeonites, they don't deserve to receive this acceptance by God and with his people. However, remember, we're told in Deuteronomy 9, we looked at it when we were looking at Rahab, neither did the Israelites deserve to receive the promised land. It wasn't because they were great. And neither do we deserve. We don't deserve to receive forgiveness and acceptance in the family of God and all the blessings that entails. In all these cases, it's not due to us. It's due to God, to his mercy, to his grace, to his love, that we are accepted. And you know, if you think about it, like the Gibeonites, we also, if we're honest, we come to God under very different circumstances, don't we? We don't all come to God to believe in Jesus in the same way. And often, well, I'd say always, we come to God initially out of very selfish reasons, like the Gibeonites. What do I mean? Well, we come to God in our hopelessness, and we find purpose. We come to God in our restlessness, and we find peace. We come to God perhaps in our loneliness, and we find acceptance and love and belonging. We come to God in our fear of his judgment upon our sins, and we find forgiveness. Now, if you think about it, all those reasons are essentially selfish. They're what we can get out of it. We don't come to God initially because we want to glorify God. Not at all. It's only after we've come to God and experience his grace and get to know him and his purposes, then we want to begin to live for his glory. But initially, no, we come to God because we want things, like the Gibeonites. We need God. They're selfish reasons. But the wonderful truth is this, that God accepts us just as we are, as we come to him, in all our need, because he's a God of grace. Just as I am, without one plea but that your blood was shed for me, and that you bid me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come. Just as we are. Amazing grace. With all our mixed motives, he accepts us. So we glory in his grace. And finally, we trust in God's sovereign providence. This is the amazing thing that we see from this passage in the ensuing history of the Israelites. We trust that as God promises in Romans 8:28, he will work all things together for our good. Now that's not in any way to excuse sin, to accept sin, or to excuse our disobedience. That actually, as we see here in the passage, of course, the Gibeonites didn't escape punishment for their deceit. They were given this huge task of always being the water carriers and providing wood for the tabernacle, and then in later years in their history for the temple. That's how they served. They were at the altar day in, day out. But because of that, they saw the sacrifices. They experienced the worship of the true God. And the biblical record tells us that these people were eventually fully incorporated into the life and the congregation, the worshipping people of Israel. Despite this deceitful beginning, they came to know and to serve and to worship the God of Israel in his providence. this very menial, this very low down, if you like, this servant activity on behalf of the worship, bringing in the water, carrying the wood to help the worship of the living God, it gave the Gibeonites a place of religious honor in the history of the nation of the Israelites. And when the land was divided at the end of Joshua, Gibeon, where they were from, was one of the cities that was given to the line of Aaron, to the priests, because of their duty. Gibeon became known as a special place of God. 400 years later, David put the tabernacle at Gibeon until the temple was built. The altar, the priesthood, was there in Gibeon. And actually, much later, if you read on, after the Babylonian captivity, centuries later, the Bible tells us that there were 500 true believers, Gibeonites, among the people who returned. And Ezra tells us that the Gibeonites were totally committed to the Lord and to his house. Nehemiah tells us that the Gibeonites were involved in the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. They were right there, in God's providence. God blessed these people. In his grace, he'd accepted them, and in his providence, now these people and the nation of Israel was blessed because of their presence, because of their faithfulness, because of their contribution. It's amazing. Now, as I say, that's not in any way excusing sin, the way in which they came, but in his grace, God overrules these things. God does work in all things for our good. The mistakes we make, yes, they embarrass us, rightly. We are sorry for them, especially perhaps the mistakes, the bad decisions that we make that are caused by prayerlessness and not really seeking God's will, and we regret them and so on. And sometimes we have to face the consequences of those decisions in our lives. But, above and beyond all, we need to remember that no mistake is final for the sincere Christian by the grace of God. Failure is not final if you're a child of God. And although that doesn't excuse our sins and our mistakes, we can rest in the fact that his grace is all sufficient. And that failure is not final, because his grace and his providence can overrule and change, and God can work all things together for good to those who love him. So, let's be encouraged, I think, this morning. We can use even our blunders, even our mistakes, to accomplish his purposes in his divine plan. Let's be encouraged by his grace. Let's not be dogged and harassed by our past. We may have to live with the consequences of some of the decisions we make, but God is able to turn them to good, to use them for his glory. Well, let's give thanks to him as we close and sing our last two songs together.